Hey Jen, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Sue.
So glad you could be here. You've recently started a job at Georgetown University,
Yeah, project director of a
project director.
national technical assistance center for in federal grantees doing infant and early childhood mental health work across the country. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the first time when I read that title that I've seen the term infant mental health.
Hmm.
I actually haven't come across that. I mean, it's sort of early childhood. I mean, I understand it. Of course, I understand it, but I just hadn't heard the term. And the fact that it's now something that people are that you're obviously working in the field and that it's being acknowledged, it's it sort of can't help but feel a bit of a sad indictment on humanity that we have to have a term like that we use. But
Yeah, I will tell you, a lot of folks, when they hear mental health, they immediately go to mental illness or some sort of problematic thing. But and probably many of your listeners know that we all have mental health, every single one of us, whether it's poor or whether it's healthy, right? And in the first 3 to 5 years of life, that's when our sorry about my phone, that's when 80 to 90% of our brain volume is developing, and that's where we are setting the foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. And so another maybe more effective term for infant early childhood mental health would be social and emotional development and healthy attachment, right? So it's really about supporting caregivers to engage in that attuned, sensitive, serve and return interaction so we can build strong brain architecture and set the stage for positive, healthy mental health throughout the lifespan. So infant mental health can sometimes make people think about babies on the couch doing psychoanalysis, being sex. That's not what it is, right? But it is a very positive thing that can prevent lots of problematic issues down the road.
Absolutely. It's interesting just to have observed myself making that sort of, the mental health link. But we talk about physical health, and I don't. When someone says physical health, I don't automatically think of physical ill health. So there you
Mm-hmm.
go. I'm kind of programmed that way. We're all a product of our society, aren't we?
Sure are.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Not
love
alone.
I love the description that you just gave and launching straight into the building strong brains, idea because we've recently been trained as trainers in the Building Strong Brains with Melissa and Richard at TCCY, and you were there at the beginning. You kind of brought that program into being. Why don't we start with just how you would like to describe your journey into this space? How did it sort of all start for you, and what are some of those steps along the road that you've taken to get to where you are?
Absolutely. I will try the abbreviated version. Because of course, there are lots of little steps, and I do feel like the universe has guided me toward where
Yeah.
I am today. So, what I would say is, I've always wanted to work with and on behalf of kids since I was a kid myself. Without getting into too much of my own history, we'll just say that, I knew I had a voice and I knew how much adult support meant to me. And I wanted to be an adult that supported, that saw kids for who they were, help them feel validated and like they had a voice, like they were seen, just to pass along the support that I'd been given by different people's parents and teachers and all kinds of things. So first I thought I want to be a teacher, then, yada, yada, yada. And so long story short, I got a psychology degree from Berry College. And anybody who's ever gotten a psychology degree knows you can't really do much with that. So I was looking to, yeah, I was looking to get a clinical, go get my doctorate in clinical psychology. And I just realized that that wasn't the path for me, right? So I started working in community mental health right after graduating college, started working with adults with severe and persistent mental health issues, many of whom were being pushed into the community after being in a state-run psychiatric facility for a long time. And was a case manager for them, trying to help support them to be living in a stable way in the community. So after I'd done that for a bit, I just was like, man, I'm not cut out for this. And so I started working with kids doing case management. And that was a whole other challenge. And I think that a lot of people have a similar story to me, where you start working, in direct service, and you see so many systems holes, right? You see so many ways in which the system is not only like failing the child, right? Like not reaching its goal, but actually is working against its goal, right? It's further traumatizing children. It is pushing them down that, preschool to prison pipeline. And being a case manager, I was able to form relationships, and I certainly know from the literature and from personal experience that relationships matter. And I didn't have a lot of influence, and I wanted more influence. And I could see how working with kids at the beginning, how they progressed and became worse over time. And that was incredibly disheartening, and I wanted it to stop. So I ended up working for a child abuse prevention agency. I could get behind prevention. I was like working my way more up the prevention ladder. I worked there for 6 years and was the associate director at the end. And I got my master's degree, in social work, and was very motivated. That's where I learned about the adverse childhood experiences study and got a nice grounding in childhood trauma. And everything started to click for me. It was like, oh, I don't have to pick one thing to care about. I can care about supporting children to optimally develop. And then that allows me to positively influence, and be a solution for all the things I care about: substance abuse, incarceration, mental illness, right? All of those sorts of things, the foundation, the start, the sort of first domino that's being pushed is the early experiences in life. So I just thought to myself, if everybody could get this, right? If everybody could understand this, we could change the world. And the literature is very clear on that. We can, if we come together as a community, as a collective society, and understand this science of early brain development and early relational health, and understand how to break intergenerational trauma, right? Generations and generations of trauma that are compounded by other societal issues like oppression and systemic racism and all of that stuff, and contribute to that issue. So say that to say, at the end of my time with the Family Center, which is where I worked, I started with 2 other people. I was co-founder for a collective impact initiative in Nashville, Davidson County, where we were seeking to reduce adverse childhood experiences at the population level. And just like my light bulb went off, and the light bulbs of many others who have heard about this science, we saw it just taking off in the community, and lots of people wanting to join this effort. It became more than 80 organizations represented with 400 members. And that was where I was like, this is where I'm meant to be. I then was asked to join the staff at Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. And it was there that I was able to really support a lot of the work with Building Strong Brains Tennessee, with one of my primary responsibilities being I like to call it the curation of that curriculum, and rolling out the training for trainers. And I say curation because we didn't do any of our own research. It was a compilation of everybody else's work, and using evidence-based communication. And really, we did have support from Harvard Center on the Developing Child and the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. They looked it over. They were so gracious with their time and vetted it for us. So though I was like in charge of it, I was not alone in many hands made light work there. So we trained over 1,200 people, and they've presented to over 80,000 people. And that's, conservative estimate. And now we're reaching folks in Australia.
That's right.
So the legacy lives on. So a lot of good stuff keeps coming out of Building Strong Brains. But I just recently left and went to support this National Technical Assistance Center, to continue to try to spread the word and do more great public health, community prevention, building strong brains work.
Yeah,
So that's the
absolutely.
short version of the story.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. It's so interesting to me how the parallels exist, and but I think there's something that happens inside anybody that discovers the ACE study. Bridget used the term, it's the aha moment that means so much. If it really lands, like if you don't just take it at an intellectual level and go, yeah, yeah, well, that makes sense. But you go, the implications of everybody knowing this. Like, it is such underpinning work. And very early on, I was passionate about education. I loved learning. I was always a learner as a child, and I liked school. I think I had good teachers. It worked for me. So I was passionate about it. I had a break and I went traveling to Europe and opened myself to the world in my gap year. And I loved university and I loved it and I thrived. I'm doing the course because I loved learning and I was going to be a primary school teacher. And I was very, very quickly disheartened in the system because I was, moving into my 20s and realizing a lot of other things about life and exploring spirituality. Interestingly, started with Native American wisdom because I'd met a Cherokee guy in Australia, and my boyfriend's sisters were into that, and so we were talking about it and going, "Wow, these earth cultures. There's so much wisdom in this, and there's a beautiful idea. I'd love to understand more about Native American culture because they have this idea." Of every decision we make affects the next 7 generations. And I thought, wow, so that means I've been affected by the previous 7 generations, and that's too far back for my mind to even conceive. I can go back 4 generations, but then it starts to get too many, like the doubling up of our ancestors. I kind of went, oh, that's why it's a tree. Like that's why it's a family tree because there's just so many people. I've got like 32 great 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 grandparents. Which one? Which one? So which one am I affected by? So it's this huge sort of explosion, which I think is what your 20s is about. I love it. But I sat in this staff room and went, the teachers aren't talking about kids. They're talking about the budget, or I don't know, like I felt really disheartened very quickly that the changes that I could see we would make, and it was always about the brain. It was interestingly, even then in those, and I didn't know much about it, but any little bit of neuroscience I got even in the early 90s, where there was a bit of an escalation starting to happen in brain science back then, I thought, oh, this has got to apply. The more we understand about child development and how we actually grow, the more we can do to make it better. Now it's 2021, right? So, like, oh, it's still not happening. So, yeah, I totally relate to that idea, but I ended up taking myself off on an alternative life journey, left society altogether. Haven't sort of really talked to a lot of people about this,
Wow, I didn't
but
know
when
that.
not many people do, I don't tell that story, but you've generated my story because I'm thinking about how it all, how we're led to this moment. And but I really am an experiential learner, and that's what I wanted to do. So I've literally lived below the poverty line. I've sort of rejected a lot of. The more I understood about how I thought life really should be, the more I felt like I'd been duped. And
Mm,
I was a conformist, and I was successful in that world, but I couldn't live it because I thought, what
mhm.
about everybody else? What about all those other people? I ended up coming back around in Tasmania and working in classrooms from K to 12, which is also pretty unusual. So I have actually been right across the spectrum of schooling. When I got to the end of teaching a year 12 group and thought, it just gets harder. And, you know, the kids that are disengaged back here, they've had their whole childhood. I'm devastated by the idea that whole childhood is lost. And my kids, I put them through it. So I want to make a change there before I die so that my grandkids don't have to have the same system. And it's not a disregard for the teachers because they're sort of stuck as well. It's this systemic change that we want to see across the board. That this work in brain development, understanding early brain development, the importance of secure attachment, its impact if we don't have it, that's the work that underpins, like you said, all else. It really shifts everything else. And I see this idea of building these foundations, like if a building doesn't have strong foundations, we can sometimes prop it up for a while and get the foundations rebuilt underneath, and then we fix everything else on top, and it will last another, X amount of time. So it's just fascinating to me, and I just feel like everybody who gets the ACEs study and really understands what you've put together through Building Strong Brains is set on a new path.
Yeah, I liken it to, when you're lighting someone else's torch or lighting someone else's candle, like it doesn't take away from your fire, but it spreads,
Mm.
and that has been what happened to me and what I've been able to be a part of, because once you know it, you want everyone to know it. And I will say that I often tell people, because as you know, I've presented to a variety of audiences from all walks of life. And I tell them, I've trained people from all walks of life too, like to be trainers. And my reaction, or what I say rather, is no matter what it is you care about this, right? You can hate, not hate babies, but you cannot like babies. You cannot like toddlers.
Yeah, you don't
Um,
have to.
yeah, that's right. But something that you care about, whether it is your local economy and the way your taxes are spent, whether it is the safety, like at the most basic level, the safety of yourself and your family, or whether it's about a myriad of other causes, heart disease, cancer, criminalization, K through 12 education and academic success, name a thing,
Yeah.
a societal thing, it's connected to adverse childhood experiences or lack thereof, right? When we have healthy kids that have strong, healthy attachments and safe, stable, nurturing environments, they thrive and they don't struggle with these things. What we see in our society, the challenges, the barriers, those are the negative outcomes of not having the support early on from adults. And you mentioned being a teacher in your journey. I cannot tell you how many teachers really get the aha moment, because no teacher goes into the field thinking, I want to talk about budgets all day, right? Like no teacher goes into the field thinking, I want to, do standardized tests. They all go into the field because they have a servant's heart, because they love kids. They want to do this work. And then, as you mentioned, the system just can suck it out of them. And they've never had exposure to the science, and they become cynical or overwhelmed or burned out. And once they know this, and it leads to a personal change in terms of the way that they're interacting with their students, the way that they're interacting with themselves, and also like just reinforces for them the reason why they started in the first place, because they understand, yes, I can affect change. I am literally changing somebody's brain architecture. And what I do today, or what I do on a consistent basis with this child, will affect how they are at 80 when I'm long and gone. So teachers have been among the most powerful allies and advocates in this science.
Yeah. Wow. You bring so many memories to mind. And I just think, yeah, that's absolutely right. Before I knew about ACEs, I was already getting that. I mean, anyone who's a coalface worker, anybody who's working on the front lines in any capacity, is hearing the stories, is seeing the suffering, is growing their compassion. And I think the longer we live and the more I experienced, some life challenges of my own, then that automatically, builds compassion as well for other people's stories. Yeah, you're just bringing me, you're taking me back into that space. I got to the end of teaching year 12 and I said to Bridget, she was at the same school as me that year, and we were both a bit pained by the whole academic sort of process and, trying to grade kids that hadn't really done much work, and we couldn't sort of push it out of them. And there's a whole lot of reasons for it. And I just thought, I don't like this. I don't like having to sort of give them an assessment. I say, okay, I'm done. I've got to that, I've got to the end of this now. What are we going to do? And I said, would you meet with me? We'd seen each other over the years in passing at the fruit shop or in the school, or we'd never actually been friends. I'd learned about this concept called masterminding. And it's where you deliberately sit down, we set an intention for solving a problem. We mastermind on it together. So I said, would you come and work with me on this? And I felt a little bit uncomfortable, but we these clear intentions, and we just clicked on this idea. And within a matter of weeks of meeting, once a week, I said, I've got to introduce you to Mike. And so I invited him over, and that day, Bridget had arrived at my place with Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. And her
Right
and
there,
Mike, yeah. And she just said, this has changed everything. This has like brought everything together for me. And it's his life's work, 40 years, it's complex trauma. There's a name for what we're seeing in these kids. And there's, not that we're not diagnosing, we don't, we're not clinicians, but we're there with them every day. So then she very soon after that discovered the ACEs study and the idea of social change, because it was always like, we can see what the problem is, but it feels so complex and overwhelming. What do you do? But it was really Bridget that kept bringing. She has prophetic dreams as well. So she goes, I had a dream and it was like this happened and I got this message. And, then it was quite an amazing process. And also her science, her passion was switched on, and she was just digging and diving down rabbit holes and finding everything she could and tossing out that work which wasn't peer reviewed, and came to the Harvard Center for the Developing Child as one of the best, most and Robert Anders' work. But she also said it's got to be grassroots, like the real change. Because I kept saying, look, I don't want to focus on trauma. I understand, but what we put our attention to is what we grow. We've got to think about what we want. So we came up with, I remember a penny drop moment where the phrase from traumatized to self-actualized. I'm like, okay, if it's about that, then I'm in. But I was really resistant to, because I could feel that it can bog you down. It's like, hang on. I wrote a paper in my second year at university on mental health, and it was a literature review, and I was just commenting on the work that was predicting that mental ill health would be our biggest health issue in 20 years' time. This was in the
Mhm.
early 90s. So it's been really interesting to just kind of, didn't obsess over it, but every now and again I just go, wow, it's really happening. Like, I'm watching this unfold.
Yes.
It has to be grassroots. Yeah. So how do we change this complex problem? Well, there's got to be a grassroots foundation to it. It's got to be a network, and then it's just got to be about this information becoming common knowledge. So that's now our mission statement: making
Yes.
complex trauma common knowledge. How important do you think it is that this is really understood at the grassroots level? Because it's service providers, absolutely, of course, but the people who are suffering most from ACEs, how important is that, do you think?
Wow, that's a great and deep question. And I have a multi-part answer. So I'm going to start with like our approach in Tennessee and even the approach with ACE Nashville. And then I'm going to give you a second answer when you're asking about folks, which ACEs are common, right? Trauma is common. So folks that hear this message and the way in which it's received. So starting with the first part of my answer, an empowered public is the most powerful tool anyone has, right? Because an empowered public changes systems, laws. They're your voters.
Yeah,
No
exactly.
matter, in many ways, no matter where you are, even if you're in one of the most challenging countries, we look at these women and grassroots movements that were the thing that topples dictatorships or whatever, right? So you cannot overstate the amazing ability of an empowered public. So you can look at any other public health issue where the public understands it, right, is not fed misinformation. And then once you know it, you can't unknow it, right? And you do your life differently. You do your life differently. You do your life differently with the people you're in community with. You do life differently with your own family, with your offspring, and it changes things. So often with building strong brains, we would give the example of, changing the culture of smoking. So in most developed countries in the world, probably in most of the world, everybody knows negative health outcomes from smoking. You're not going to go up to a smoker and say, oh, did you know that's going to give you cancer? And them say, really? I thought it was healthy for me, right? They know, right? So if they're making that choice, we cannot liken smoking to trauma, but in the public health sphere, we saw a major change in tobacco consumption and smoking culture across the globe once people were empowered with the knowledge. And, germ theory, I mean, just name a thing, right? We have had so much success by empowering our public. And it has meant changes for our children. 30, 40 years ago, if your kid was near a smoker, you would move your kid away maybe. Now you're like, get that cancer stick away from my child. What are you thinking, right? You're so empowered to advocate for yourself and your children. So this is more true with adverse childhood experiences, because even if you have an A score of 0, even if you feel like you're not immediately affected by ACEs, once you understand the message, you understand your piece in the social fabric, and you understand the ways in which other people's trauma shows up in your life directly or indirectly, in the workplace, like I said, in crime in your community, in terms of how your tax dollars are being spent, all of the things, it's affected by that. And so most people, in my philosophy is, most people are good. And once they understand something, they want to apply that knowledge to a solution. People don't want to be helpless and throw up their hands and say, I don't know how to deal with this. They want to create a better world, and they want to create a better world for their children and their children's children, just like you were saying. And so that is a powerful mechanism. I've often said that our strategy needs to be grassroots to grass tops. So yes, we do need policymakers to understand this. We do need funders to understand this, because once they put their weight behind it, you can get traction at a rapid pace. But if you don't have an empowered public, it will never sustain. Leaders change, priorities change, and ensuring that knowledge stays consistent with your population ensures that it remains a priority. So that is like my first part of my answer. My second part of my answer, from interpersonal, just friends, people I've trained, but also I used to teach parent education classes in jails. And a big part of our curriculum in the jail and in substance abuse treatment facilities, so both. Big part of our message was, here are what adverse childhood experiences are. These are the outcomes. And we were very purposeful not to let it be a disempowering, you've screwed your kids up message. That's not productive. Instead, the message was, you're not bad, you're hurt, right? Because people, they already feel guilty, right? They're in jail. They've been struggling with substance misuse. They feel badly about what their children have had to go through, because oftentimes they had to go through it themselves, so they know exactly what it feels like.
And they didn't want their kids to go through it, and then it was that program in them that it happened anyway. Yeah, awful.
Yes, there's so much guilt and shame. And again, we know from the literature, guilt and shame are not productive feelings, right? Because they just make you want to just get away from it. You want to escape the discomfort. And so a lot of these folks were double hurting, right? They were hurting from their childhoods. They're hurting from the experiences that they've given their children. And they think to themselves, I'm a bad person. I've got bad genes, right? I'm born this way. I can't change. I resign. And when they learn this science and they realize they're not bad, they're hurt, when they understand the mechanisms, which honestly, it's widely accessible. I have not met somebody who can't get it, then suddenly they can take the blame and shame off of themselves. They can say, now I understand how I ended up here. And most importantly, they understand a pathway to change for their children. So we had a story I often tell is about a gentleman who had, after a while, he was resistant at first, but after a while in these classes, he was like, I was neglected. My mom did the best she could. She provided what she could. She also was hurt, like he could get that. And he's like, but now I understand how I'm here. And now I'm going to make efforts in a different way with my kids. Instead of just like shutting down and avoiding the pain and shame, I see a pathway. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to say, how do you feel about me being in jail? And when he did this, the response was that his child told him, "I'm mad at you." Actually, used more expletives than that, but essentially was able to
Mm.
have the space to say, "I am mad at you," and then that person to say, "I get it and I'm sorry," and to understand that it's not going to heal overnight, but that presence and that acceptance and that understanding of the power of relationships and the way in which they can break the cycle is so motivational and brings so much hope. So that was a long answer to your
I
question about
love it. I
the
love
woman
your
in
answers. I
the
love all of it. It's like, oh my gosh, so good. It's just so refreshing when you have a conversation with someone who really gets it. And we've just met, but it's like I feel like we've known, we're so on the same path, and I just can't wait to meet you in person.
Well,
You know what?
if you need to fly me out to Australia, I'll be there.
Yeah, yeah. Totally, totally. It's our fundraising plan. Hey, there's so many things, but one of them was the realization that we were going to. I think in some ways, like Australia was founded even though we are very multicultural now, but we were founded, um, you know, as a modern society after the land was kind of taken from the Aboriginal people. Our society, as we know it, was founded from the British system, and there's a conservative element to that. So even the idea of going out, we decided we needed to have a big community forum because we needed to tell people about ACEs and we needed to get the message about collaborating across the services out. And so our first sponsor was Mike Gaffney, who I'm interviewing on Monday actually, and he's a member of the Legislative Council and an all-round good guy. We love him, and the people do. And he's been a great people's representative in the Tasmanian Parliament for quite a long time. So he immediately got it and said, "Well, I'll put on a forum for you." And he sponsored it, and he sent out invitations, and so we did have a wonderful 200 strong audience, which is in a tiny town, was great. And they were from local, state, and federal parliament. They were from all of the services, the social services, social workers, psychologists, nurses, education department. The Minister for Education sent his personal assistant to our follow up meeting. The police commissioner sent a delegate to our follow up meeting. The problem was at that time we didn't quite have a plan about how to make it work, but we got the message out there, and all those people have been moving with the information. The education system is training teachers, and so we're really grateful for what we've seen unfold as we kind of get our big picture plan together for the grassroots. But we said, we've got to bring the elephant out of the corner. And we talked about no shame, no blame. It's such an easy roll off the tongue, and important. It could become cliche, but it's actually such a powerful statement, because shame is really, and Brene Brown's work you mentioned earlier really did bring to the surface the core of that. The core of domestic violence and all of that comes back to shame, is what the research tells us. But I love the statement that you just made. And by the way, we really want to work in prisons and with the addicted, because these are the people who are suffering the most. Their lives are completely impacted, and they need to know this for that empowerment, motivation. The motivation that all of a sudden I'm having all these ideas, like my brain is switching on
Yes.
to creative possibilities. There's no greater gift that we could give
Mm.
someone. But I love what you said, that they take the blame and shame off themselves. Because if we really want to be honest, we're sitting here even as we speak and saying, them and those people. And it's like, we try not to do that. Hang on a minute. This is me. The reason I understand something of this is because we've all got, the way I see it is we're all on the trauma spectrum. Like we started saying, we're all on the autism spectrum. Who doesn't have or I don't know, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but we all have self-limiting beliefs in some way. We've all had moments where we started to tell ourselves that we weren't something enough, we weren't good enough, strong enough, smart enough, fit enough, beautiful enough, whatever it may be. We all have a version of it enough to understand that when we see it in the extreme, in somebody else's extreme suffering, and extreme behaviors as a result of that suffering, that we can have compassion, you know. But I just love that you are saying that the people in the prison right now that are living that, you've given us that story, but give me a response to just taking a little deeper dive into that idea and what that really means for humanity.
Absolutely. And I do appreciate, let me do say, you saying we
We. This is
Right.
us.
We are. You listen to the stories of these folks, which, by the way, we administered the ACEs questionnaire to over 1,400 folks that were incarcerated and in substance abuse treatment facilities in a trauma informed way. I want to say to your
Yes,
audience, there
yes,
is a non-trauma informed way to do that.
yeah,
So do
absolutely.
your homework, look at trauma informed ways of distributing the questionnaire, because it can be powerful, but there is a way in which you do it. We found that the average ACE score, that over 70% had an ACE score of 6 or more. And for women, like the average ACE score was 8, 9, among the highest. And that's looking at traditional, like the first 10 adverse childhood experiences. We now know from the literature that our definition of adverse childhood experiences is expanding to include racism, bullying, living in foster care, those sorts of events. And I suspect that 20 years from now, we will see things like being a refugee from a war-torn country, right? Like we will see the traumas
Yeah.
that we all know contribute, even from their own independent literature, contribute to poor health outcomes. They will be validated in the way in which these have been validated.
Just on that note, the CPTSD definition from the World Health Organization does include those
Yes,
experiences. Yeah.
I think that's so wise. I mean, and they are traumas. I mean, we know they're traumas, but
Yeah.
sometimes they're not included on that original ACE
Yeah.
questionnaire.
Yeah.
So once you start to get to know people, once you start to hear their story, you think, wow, who wouldn't end up here? Who wouldn't? And when you see folks that are able to rise above whatever, there's always a relationship there, right? There is somebody who is there to support them. Nobody, is successful on their own. Our brains are social organs. Our brains and bodies are literally built based on and function based on the experiences we have with other people. And when you see somebody who came out against the odds, if you say, well, tell me more about like how, the pathway to your success. How did you get to start, doing well in school? How did you get to do this? And you hear about people. And what we see often in the lives of these folks is not only systemic oppression and issues, we see lots and lots of trauma. We see an absence of resources and a prevalence of not just interpersonal trauma, but community trauma, and lack of access, most importantly, to people, And so, yes, it's not a they, them. It's not that there's something different about them. It's that we have the privilege and benefit of having a different story. That story still involves pain. That story may, for much of the population, does involve some level of negative adverse childhood experience, whether it was traumatic or not, right? Because not all ACEs are traumatic. It depends. There's other factors there. And also people experience trauma as adults. We can't forget that too. It's not
Mm.
as impactful in the way, because our brains and bodies are developed, right? But it's still impacting our body. So
Absolutely.
so I don't know if that answered your question,
Yeah, that's
but
all right. It was all good anyway, whether it does.
which
It's
is the short
about,
answer for
it
you.
was the idea. Well, it wasn't really a question, actually. It was just picking up on the piece that you said about taking the blame and shame off themselves. And I guess it's that my understanding currently of, of the role that our caregivers give us when we're little is, they take care of us and basically teach us how to take care of ourselves. Whatever form their taking care is what we kind of adopt. And it just makes sense, like, of course, we're going to, as young people, mirror, we're going to mirror, we're going to imitate. And that's always confronting for parents when they hear their child speak the way that they just spoke, that they were in denial of, part of their character, or, the child uses a tone back with them and go, oh, did I speak to you that way? Whoops, better fix that, or whatever, or the swearing, or whatever it is that they suddenly say. We do learn to care about ourselves in that way. And I have to say, I'm completely blessed because I'm the third of 7 children that, were born in less than 9 years. We all knew, the 7 of us, without. I was just writing a journal entry that I've always known for a long time. I accepted that I had a mum who was able to give unconditional love. Like, I knew that I was unconditionally loved. So as much as there were, little issues and I might have self-limiting beliefs and whatever, that I can predominantly look back on my childhood and I can see myself laughing and feeling full of life and joy and energy and learning and wanting to be, with people and that sort of thing. So, I really have been gifted in that way. Interestingly, my adult trauma was when mum had a brain aneurysm and she was gone. But it's amazing how much having that support gives you the strength for so much. It gives you the strength for everything because, yeah, the confidence is there. I'm sort of drifting off on a little tangent there with my mum. She passed away a few years ago, but she was less severely brain damaged from an aneurysm. So that was a trauma that I was teaching at the time, and I realized, I actually said to my students from that moment sort of on, if you have anything going on that is keeping you from being able to engage with learning in the classroom, I get it. Like, I'm not coping at the moment. So just tell me because we'll work with it. It was really powerful in that way, just to really understand how tough it is when you've got something personal going on, someone that you don't know is going to live or die in your family that you care about. So I wanted to jump to another place
Okay.
before we go. We've talked about the grassroots and we've talked about, and I do really appreciate those stories. How important is it? I know you've said from the grassroots to the grass top. I have this dream, and I've heard. I think it was on the series of podcasts through TCCY, perhaps, but I'm
Oh,
not sure.
things.
CTIC, is that what they're called?
Oh, CTIP. No, I wish
CTIC,
that I
yeah.
could take credit for that, but no, CTIP is a national campaign. They're their own entity. So they
Okay.
stand, just for your listeners, if they want to look them up, it stands for Campaign on Trauma Informed Policy and Practice.
Well, we want to operate at that level as well. And I did listen to one of their recorded presentation they did somewhere, but I love the idea of trauma informing our leaders, our political leaders. I mean, take them through. And I just feel like everybody needs building strong brains. Like, I think, why would we question it? Like, we've got the training we did is version 4, and we've got Harvard Center for the Developing Child, world leaders. It's approved by Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, world leaders. They're leading the way in this work. Yale have supported it, and apparently a PhD who works with Dr. Robert Ander, the original ACE study. This has gone through, it's gone through the rigor, and the Frameworks Institute. Brilliant,
Yeah.
brilliant work that they do. So
Yeah.
the messaging is getting through. We're training some young apprentices, construction workers next Wednesday, and there couldn't be a more perfect metaphor, for getting them
Oh, there
through
couldn't be.
this.
Then building brain architecture. That's right.
Yes. So I look
That's
forward to giving you some feedback on how they receive it, and how beautiful the owner of this company. He has 6 offices in 2 states, and he's just this beautiful. He's been doing life skills training with his apprentices
right.
for decades. And now
Awesome.
he's including trauma awareness training for them as well. So that's a side note. Building strong brains, the same message being given to everybody, from the guys and women in prison to the leaders of the country, the Prime Minister here, or the premiers and the ministers. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say is, oh goodness, you are asking the deep questions. When you understand the science, no matter who you are, you understand solutions. you understand or you see the inefficiencies of many of our systems where we do not invest in our youngest citizens. We have this cultural perception that the youngest years don't matter because babies can't remember, not understanding this concept that you've brought up, which is body keeps the score. So even though your brain has not developed the capacity at that point to integrate long-term memories in the way that you would recall a book or a movie, your brain is literally being built around those experiences. You have implicit memories. And I believe it was maybe Bill and Melinda Gates that said, the first 2 months of your life have so much to do with how the next 80 years turn out. And yet in our country, and in many countries, not all, but in many countries, there's a complete lack of it. That is the lowest investment is made in the years that are the most impactful.
I didn't know they said that. I didn't know Bill Gates was onto this. It's good to
I
know.
know, right? Isn't that great? Yeah.
Yeah.
When you have people that are powerful, they can affect change at greater scale, and that's wonderful. If you don't have an empowered public, then it can fall off the radar because people leave or wars come or pandemics come. And when you have an empowered public, when they see the pandemic, they understand everything else that's being affected, right? They understand that additional resources are being lost for families, stress that families are experiencing, and early childhood educators are experiencing, and K through 12 teachers are experiencing, means that they're going to be less capable, have less bandwidth to engage in those essential, attuned, serve and return interactions, right? And they understand the ways in which that's going to affect this child's developing brain. Recent study that was actually released, pre-published, was around. Were you all the ones that shared? No, you weren't. But it was. Sorry, it was a
Yeah,
different
Bridget
conversation.
gave you a lot when we spoke
Yeah,
last.
she sure did. She was amazing. But Brown and other universities have been doing this work with babies for over a decade, doing different developmental screeners, et cetera, looking at IQ. And this year, when they looked at the pandemic babies, their IQ on average had dropped 20 points, right?
Oof.
So this pandemic, when you understand all of this science,
Yeah.
you understand that part of our pathway out of this, part of our recovery, is majorly investing in those babies, in those families, in early intervention, in stabilization. Because if we don't pay for it now, we will pay for it times 100 later in incarceration costs, in special education, in name a
It's
thing.
it's 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 not sustainable. Like if it's not dealt with now, we won't actually have the resources for all of that. We just won't because we're already, I mean, both our Australian government's current budget, there and the state budget in Tasmania, they have both declared and almost with pride, and it's great the record unprecedented amounts of money they're putting into mental health, and I'm looking through and I'm thinking, but how much of that is prevention? And
Yes.
there
Oh,
really isn't. And I can the system, even the political system, is set up that way because they have 3-year terms here and they may or may not get re-elected. So they want to have, they don't want necessarily the things that are going to take a long time because they want to be known for bringing about the change. I don't know. I mean, that's probably a simplistic view, but
no, it's really not.
it's just yeah, to bring, I think the message has to be given to everybody at the same time, but I love how you keep reinforcing the empowered public because that really is the only way anything in history has ever changed.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's what you just said just made me think of something, and I've lost my train of thought a bit. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Okay, we can pick it up back here.
Yeah.
I'll be with you. So one thing that we have, that you hear from Dr. Anda, that you hear from Dr. Bruce Perry, both leaders in the field, is we will never have enough treatment for the negative outcomes of trauma, right? We have to move upstream and prevent this. That's the only viable solution. Additionally, Bruce Perry has another quote that I love, which is, You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And so, when you think about clinicians and therapists, at most, you're with them an hour a week, oftentimes. You're with your teacher 40 hours a week if you're a young child, um, and at least 5-10 hours a week if you're an older child. You're with your church members a lot throughout your lifetime. You're with your neighbors, all of these other folks. And so when we empower people with this knowledge, they, as we said at the start of this conversation, they do life differently. They teach differently. To your point earlier, they say, wow, I understand that this child cannot academically engage if they're experiencing trauma. And they give a safe space and a nurturing relationship so that that child can actually re-engage at some point, whether it's not, if it's not that day, then the next day or so on. And that child says, I feel safe at school. My brain, we know from neuroscience, if you're in fight, flight, freeze, if you are stressed out, you're not in a space to learn. And so when you feel safe, you can engage in learning. You have your police officers that understand that these are not bad people, these are hurt people. And yes, my job may be to uphold the law, but I can do that in a healing and reconstructive way. And I can engage with my community in a reconstructive way and help people see me as a resource instead of yet another source of trauma, as we've seen so much. It's always existed, but now it's just being elevated because of cell phones and social media. People do life differently, and they become therapeutic without even meaning to become therapeutic. And they get to realize their purpose as a police officer, to keep the public safe, to make their community better, as a teacher, to educate, to build relationships, as an early childhood educator, that you're not a glorified babysitter. You are literally building the foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. Or whether it's a policymaker that can see, wow, the policies I enact today are going to affect my great grandchildren in the future. So it doesn't matter, a physician, like the way,
Yeah.
we look at trauma-informed care in medicine, and you see decreased rates of people suing you, because they feel like they're heard, they're relational. And now we see studies that show that active listening and understanding of that trauma component helps people have less emergency room interactions and are less costly to the healthcare system. So again, I could go on and on and on and on, but this empowers our society to be a helpful, therapeutic society that can actually be the antidote or mitigate the impact of adversity. And that's a powerful thing. So yes, policymakers and everybody in between,
Absolutely.
it's
I'm
magical.
reading, yeah, I love that. I'm listening to Dr. Anthony Bigland's Nurture Effect at the moment on Audible, and he's basically right across, he's a prevention scientist. I didn't even know there was that label. I'm like, oh my God, I love that there's prevention scientists in the world. But he's all about evidence-based programs. Like, I just love his work. I'm going to have to buy the book and mark it because and work with it because yeah, it's all about evidence-based success stories, programs and practices and policies that have the evidence backing them, profound amounts of study, number of studies and research on what really works. But it's all about, he calls it this nurture consilience, that, all these different branches of the human sciences, including economics, have come to the same conclusion on their own, that
Yep.
nurturing societies is the answer.
Yep.
John Lennon said it, right? Love is the
Yep.
answer. What was the question? Love is the answer. Like, it's that, it's like who we are. So, yeah. So I just think this information is absolutely, absolutely for anybody who interacts with people in the world. So
Yeah.
we got to get this out there.
Yeah. May I say one more thing? Because you brought this up for me several times, which is, you talk about the aha moment. You just talked about John Lennon's, you know, lyrics.
Love is the answer.
Yes. And the reason that this sits so profoundly with people is because, and you even started the conversation talking about Native American or indigenous cultures and their wisdom, which we often don't recognize. We think that we know something new and they've been doing it forever. You know what I mean? But I say all that to say that there is this sits well with us because we intuit it, we know it. There are different sayings around the world, but people will say she's lived a hard life, and you can tell because she, when you live a hard life, it leads to this, that, and the other. People intuit this long before the brain science. People who are educators, they know, right? They know certain things before they know it. And then empowering them with this science just gives them the framework and the words to
Yeah.
be able to articulate and act on what they
Mm.
already know as humans,
That's
So
part of what,
yeah,
sorry. Yeah, Bridget was just saying, I mean, she said it before, but she just mentioned it again the other day when we were talking. We've got TANA is about giving people the words.
yeah,
That's what we want to do because language is empowering. And it's not
sure.
just the words to use with other people, but it's even the language because if you look at the brain, the right side of the brain doesn't have speech centers. So
Yeah.
we're feeling beings who can speak, but we've got to translate even that message and that understanding at the self level first. Self-awareness is really my passion, that I can't help anybody else until I really understand myself. Knowing those is the beginning of all wisdom. It was my first quote that I wrote on the board at the beginning of every school year, and I would explain it to the kids, and they'd kind of sit there and go, hmm. but
Well,
it,
you never know what seed you were planting.
yeah, but it's always, I said things, I've always had a lot of, that's it, it is about seed planting. You mentioned that earlier that made me think, yeah, but it really is, we don't know what effect we're having, we're building on something for them. But the truth, I've always said that to kids, you always know, people feel the truth. People feel the
Yes.
truth, and that is precognitive. That's the feeling is grabbed first. Yeah, oh my gosh, I've loved this conversation. I want to do more. I want to have more conversation with you over the time, but I'm really aware that we're at the end of our time. We've gone just a little bit over. Can I just ask you one more thing?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yes.
because you came to me through Melissa at Tennessee Commission for Children and Youth, and we had that introduction, and then we hadn't sort of picked that up because I was busy. But then I reached out to Suki and on the roadmap to resilience topic, and she said, "Oh, you've got to meet Jenn Drake-Croft," and and then you were just there, like you were so ready, to meet us as well. So, what made you say yes to Tana so readily?
Oh, that is a great question. I am such a believer in this network supporting each other. The generosity, we've talked about Alberta and Harvard Center on the Developing Child and others. These are very important institutions. And when we were starting up in Tennessee, their generosity advanced us probably 5, 6 years, if not 10. We
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of steps because we could use materials that they previously developed.
Yeah.
The goal is a healthier world. It's not just a healthier Tennessee, it's not just a healthier America, it is a healthier world. We want all people to thrive. This science is universally applicable. Our brains all develop in relationship. Our bodies are all affected by trauma, and all of our bodies want to heal from trauma, and the way we heal is through relationship. And so you have to have the relationship between the groups of people working on this too. It's like parallel process where we ultimately want healing relationships at the micro level, at the individual level,
Yeah.
but that comprises having healing relationships at the most macro level. It's tomorrow, where you are, it's tomorrow morning where you are, it's evening where I am. And yet we have been able to come to, just through our 2 conversations, some really profound conclusions. We've been able to learn from one another, and that relationship is helping us help others, So that's why I've
Yeah.
seen the power of relationship here. And I want everyone to know this. And the more that people, goodness, I am going on and on, but again, the pandemic has so helped people see how integrated we all are, how closely linked we all are on this little planet we call Earth. And so when we benefit people in Australia, they're benefiting people in other places. Who knows who will listen to this podcast? Who knows who will be inspired? Who knows what further relationships we can develop because of this? And I just have such respect and gratitude for that. Sorry.
Likewise. Oh, hug.
No, virtual.
It's so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. And I would love to have another conversation, whether it be on this
Yeah,
or just
yeah,
one-on-one.
yeah. There's more for us to talk about for sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a wonderful Friday evening. And your Thanksgiving's coming up too?
Thanksgiving's coming up, and that's a complicated holiday.
No
So many
doubt.
reasons,
Yeah, yeah, like Christmas.
Right. The
But
spirit of it.
at the purest level, to have a day where you are celebrating gratitude and what you can be thankful for, that's a nice thing.
That is a nice thing. That
I'm
is
thankful. I am
Okay. Thank you
thankful
so
for
much.
you.
Okay. Thankful for you. Have a great rest of your day. Okay.
Thanks. Bye bye.